Good evening and welcome to LegalTech Live, episode 72. This is a returning guest tonight and a new guest host. My returning guest is Mark Dombroff. Mark is a partner at Fox Rothschild. Mark concentrates his practice on the aviation and transportation industries, including litigation, regulatory, administrative, and enforcement matters, investigations, airport and aircraft security, and employment issues. Mark has handled numerous safety, enforcement, and regulatory matters before the Federal Aviation Administration, the National Transportation Safety Board, and other administrative agencies, whether arising from an accident or incident or other material compliance matter, including issues involving departments of state, justice, the Treasury and Homeland Security, and of course, the Transportation and Security Administration. Mark is also one of the authors and main authors, I believe, Mark, you'll have to correct me, of the Plainly Spoken blog. Were you the driving force behind the Plainly Spoken blog?
I was.
Your baby?
I think it probably is, Nick, and thank you, and I appreciate that.
My pleasure, and our guest co-host tonight, who's been begging to join me now for a couple of months.
I have.
Is Thomas Hamilton. Thomas is the VP of Strategy and Operations at Ross Intelligence, where he coordinates efforts across the company to ensure that sole practitioners, legal aid groups, law firms, government agencies, corporate law departments, state bar associations, and law faculties are able to benefit from cutting-edge developments in artificial intelligence research. Formerly an attorney at the multinational law firm Dentons, Thomas believes passionately in the ability of technology to improve access to justice worldwide, and as employee number one at Ross Intelligence, speaks to groups around the world on legal technology innovation, law firm strategy, and transformative economic potential of artificial intelligence technology. Excellent. I am really impressed by the gentleman that I have on tonight. Thank you both for being here. Thank you, Mark, for returning. Again, we bring Mark on because of his aviation knowledge, but we focus a little bit more on some of the newer aviation technology, in fact, drones. And Mark has got just a plethora of knowledge. He was a fantastic guest last time he was on. I've talked to him a little bit before the show tonight. I anticipate more outstanding information as we see drones continue. I think it's been two and a half years, best I could figure, Mark, since you were last on. I was not the best host at the time in tracking the dates of when I had everyone on, but it's been about 2.5 years, and we've seen some advancements in drone regulation and drone technology. So what are just a couple of items that you have seen, let's say in the last 3 years, that have really caught your eye?
I think you're right, Nick, on the timing. And I think the last time I was on, I'm not even sure that Part 107, which is the section of the Federal Aviation Regulations, was in effect, or if it was in effect, it had just gone into effect. So really, we had just seen, in a sense, the dawning of the drone age, so to speak. Up to that point in time, you could, drones were pretty much considered toys. They were being used recreationally or by hobbyists. I think the last 2.5 years, the regulatory structure is starting to catch up. The most important thing, I think, for everybody to realize is drones are airplanes. They are airplanes.
And tell us, for those of us who aren't familiar, what is the Part 107?
Part 107, the aviation in the United States is regulated by the Federal Aviation Regulations. And they are found in the Code of Federal Regulations, which is the regulations and the laws associated, in the case of the Federal Aviation Regulations, with aviation. There's all sorts of sections. For example, when you or I get on American or United or Delta or JetBlue or anybody, that airline is certificated pursuant to Part 121 of the Federal Aviation Regulations. And Part 107 is that section of the regulations which was adopted, which specifically addressed drones. And it was sort of the dawning of the drone regulatory age. And the reason that the Federal Aviation Regulations are regulating drones is because drones are airplanes, and regulation of airplanes, and more importantly, regulation of the operation of airplanes within the national airspace system, which is really everything from the ground up, is within the purview of the federal government, or specifically the Federal Aviation Regulations and the FAA. So since we have drones or airplanes like fixed wing or helicopters, and they operate in the national airspace system, they are regulated just like airplanes, except for the fact that you can't, for example, carry the handbooks on the drones. There's practical limitations. So there's a whole new set of regulations that will ultimately be promulgated. What we've seen since I was last on are, one, the industry has grown tremendously. The number of drones out there is enormous. But the thing that in many respects has been holding the industry back, because the FAA is not going to allow drone operation beyond visual line of sight of the operator, or other types of drone operations until drones can be remotely identified. And what does that mean? If you think of a car with having a license plate, it's pretty much in some respects the same thing. Until you can identify the drone that's flying out there from the ground through either internet or cell phone signal, the FAA is not really going to permit all sorts of other types of operations, like beyond visual line of sight, like ultimately wide-scale delivery through drones. So just at the end of December of 2019, the FAA published a 300-page notice of proposed rulemaking regarding remote identification. And they have opened that notice up to comments from the public. And I think currently there's something like 6,000 comments. And that comment period doesn't even close until the beginning of March.
Wow, that's significant.
It's very significant. And ultimately, the FAA is going to consider all of the comments, and they're going to issue a rule that requires drones to be able to be remotely identified while they're in flight. And that will really represent, once that rule is in place and is fully implemented, and they're going to phase it in over a number of years because of the number of drones that are already out there. Once that rule's implemented, we're going to start to see some real progress in the drone industry through the drone regulatory structure.
We will probably, once they can be identified as UPS drone or Amazon drone or something like that, we'll probably see some serious growth in the commercialization of these.
I think absolutely. It's you mentioned the UPS drone. I think there's another area where developments are occurring. UPS, which clearly is one of the largest airlines in the United States, obviously they deliver packages, and there are UPS airplanes flying somewhere in the world 24 hours a day. They actually have obtained certification of essentially a drone airline called Flight Forward. And they have what is called a Part 135 operating certificate, which many airlines, many operators have. So they are a fully unrestricted drone airline. Now,
interesting.
They're limited in their growth because the FAA still won't permit certain kinds of operations generally, but they are the first fully certificated drone airline. And I think that's a very good indicator of in a sense, the legitimacy of this industry, that if a major player like UPS enters this space and they know aviation, you know that there's a big future.
That I would agree with that. And Tommy, don't be shy here. I know it's your first shot here, but I know you've got a little experience in this. Jump in and ask questions, Mark.
Yeah, so that's actually a really cool segue. So right before, obviously, we started recording, Mark, I know you and I were chatting shop about Denton's, and some of the work I'd been involved in was some of our big kind of blue chip clients up in Toronto, and this was back in 2014, starting to become interested. And there have been a few sort of headline grabbing announcements. I think people are playing around with sort of drone delivery of medical supplies. There's one or two hospitals that were looking at it.
Right.
And then sort of where I got into is, because of the line of sight thing, it's going to be very complicated and it's going to play out, and then we'll see what happens. Do you think in the long term, is it going to be the major players that really come out on top on it? Or is it going to be, are you going to see more like disruptive technology play into it? And I ask that also because being based in Silicon Valley, there was an explosion in the number of drone startups.
Right.
Now we're almost at this sort of drone bubble phase where there isn't really any seed funding, popping up anymore. You're seeing the classic consolidation in the industry. So do you think the small players will create the next UPS, or is it going to be?
Yeah, Tommy, that's a great question. When I was on last with Nick, I think that we were really seeing this sort of explosion start to take place with the entrepreneurs, the Silicon Valley types, the Amazons, and everybody entering the drone space. I don't think most of them had any understanding of the fact that sort of the basic fact that drones were airplanes, and the aviation industry is one of the most regulated industries in the world. And they got, I think a lot of them got very frustrated as the industry started to develop, and as it became perhaps more and more apparent that they weren't operating in the unregulated world in a sense of Silicon Valley, that there was a certain amount of frustration set in. I think, Amazon, as I recall, got very frustrated and took their drone testing efforts outside the United States, where there was less regulation, less limitation, and the FAA really wasn't located. I think what's happened is there's been, in a sense, I've characterized it as the thinning of the herd.
Yeah.
As the industry has grown, but as it became more and more apparent to a lot of these companies, which are responsible for a lot of the growth, that this is a highly regulated industry. And at least in my mind, the way I've described it to people, that in 10 years, I think I said this a couple of years ago, and I was wrong, in 5 years, the drone industry is going to look just like the aviation industry for fixed wing and helicopters. You're going to have certification of the operators, just like you have airlines have to be certificated. You're going to have approved maintenance programs, approved training programs, approved safety programs. All of this costs money. So I think what we're
to get as well.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And people you're dealing, generally the industry is dealing with the FAA. And they're going through their own learning curve and trying to figure out, how to integrate this exploding industry of drones that everybody agrees has enormous economic potential into the existing aviation and airspace system, and not compromise this incredibly safe industry that we've built in this country. So I think we're in a transition at any number of levels. But the bottom line is drones are airplanes, airplanes are regulated, drones are going to be regulated.
And I think you did a great job of recapping where we were at in the first time that you joined the show there, Mark, because it was booming. and it was booming for hobbyists as well as commercialization. And there was a lot of, and I'm glad I brought you in on this one, Tommy, because I forgot all about the, how many stories I'd see of the drone startups at that time. It was a good good reminder of that. And I'm not seeing those stories. TechCrunch isn't releasing those anymore. A little bit like we've seen with the blockchain slowdown as well.
Yeah. Crypto,
So that's it is a really fascinating topic there, and I'm going to have that as a lead into this one, Mark, which is our friend Mitch Jackson, who I think actually came on screen with us, a lawyer out of Southern California, a good friend of mine. He is a drone hobbyist, and Mitch has asked about this new DJI Mavic and the weight of this DJI and how. So to me, based on what you just said, Mark, some of these drone manufacturers are trying to able the regulations as best they can. So they created a new one that's under a certain amount of weight. You've described to me that removes them from this ID requirement.
We did my partner Mark McKinnon and I on January 8th, and any of your viewers, any of the viewers who might want to get a copy of this can go to our blog. We did a webinar on the future of drones, remote identification of unmanned aircraft. And there's a pretty good description in the PowerPoint regarding this remote ID rule. And the remote ID rule represents probably, I think, one of the most significant turning points, in a sense, with respect to drones. And initially, in the original FAA authorization back in, I want to say it was 2016, in that time frame, whereby one could get Section 333. That was the big thing, operating authority for drones under Section 333. That authorization had another section called Section 336. And in that section, that was back a number of years ago, in that section, the FAA was prohibited by Congress from promulgating any rules or regulations that addressed the hobby or recreational industries. So they could not regulate the hobbyists' use of drones. In 2000, I want to make sure I have my dates right. I think I'm right. In 2018, there was another FAA reauthorization, and these are budget reauthorizations. And in that one, the Congress basically rescinded Section 336. And it was clear that Congress recognized that drones are airplanes and the FAA has to regulate them. Now you've got, on December 31st, as I recall, of 2019, it was December 31st that it was actually published, this 300-page notice of proposed rulemaking. And in this notice of proposed rulemaking that we've been talking about, the remote ID rule applies to all drones, and that includes recreational or hobbyist drones, but it does not apply, and here are the four exceptions, to certain amateur-built UAS-operated drones with restrictions. U.S. government.
So that's the hobbyist building their own at home.
Correct.
With restriction.
So it doesn't include, for example, DJI, because that you buy off the shelf. UAS with a takeoff weight of less than 0.55 pounds. So it's less than half a pound. And drones designed and operated solely for certain types of research or establishing regulatory compliance. The entire rest of the drone industry is essentially required, once this rule gets implemented, and there's a time frame to it, to have the remote identification capability, which means, among other things, that law enforcement on the ground. That's
fine. We like dogs. We like dogs on this show.
I think it's one of my dogs chasing the cat. It's law enforcement on the ground is going to be able to identify the drone and its owner. remotely.
This is for lay listeners, lay people, audio listeners only. This is a digital license plate. That's what the remote ID is.
It is a digital license plate, and it's very interesting because you can draw out of this regulation, Nick, a lot of parallels to existing aviation. Most airplanes that are flying in controlled airspace in airports, everything you and I may fly, all the airlines, has something called a mode C transponder, the letter C. And not only does the radar come from the ground and bounce up off the airplane and then come back to the radar, and the controller sees it on radar, but the airplane itself broadcasts a signal to the ground. And when the controller looks at his radar scope, he sees the flight number, the speed, the altitude of the airplane. And that information is coming from the airplane to the ground. Well, this remote ID capability is very similar to the Mode C transponder. So it gives instead of the air traffic controller, it gives law enforcement or other people who have the need to be able to identify the drones remotely that same type of information. The manufacturers are the ones that are going to have to come up with the technology to allow this to happen. The FAA doesn't tell people how to do it. They tell you the result they want.
Okay.
Actually, Nick, can I ask a question building on that? So we were talking about, how law enforcement will interface with the regulation of drones. Something I hear a lot about here is how law enforcement is a major consumer of drone services. So buying the hardware, but also licensing very sophisticated software that they use for infrared imaging or all sorts of different stuff. Do you see law enforcement, to the extent that they can benefit from using drones, law enforcement also, I guess, first responders and like that larger group, do you see them as a force that's going to push for less regulation so they can use drones more actively?
No, I actually think it's the other way around. I think that this remote ID rule, in large measure, one of its constituencies and one of its target audiences is law enforcement.
Oh, okay.
I think that a couple of years ago, the FAA had did a study because they wanted to come up with a risk-based analysis with respect to the use of micro drones. And they came up with a report, as I recall, and I actually think testified before the FAA committee that was dealing with this subject. But law enforcement stepped in and basically the whole project stopped because law enforcement got concerned about not so much the risk-based analysis associated with the drone striking somebody in the head or something. They got concerned with the unrestricted use of even micro drones because, and Nick and I were talking about this before he went live, the military, I am sure, has micro drones that they use out in the field and law enforcement uses them. While we've certainly seen them, on various TV shows and in the movies, I have a feeling all that stuff's real. So I think law enforcement is concerned about the unrestricted use of drones. And that's separate and apart from the fact that the unrestricted use of drones presents a risk to existing aircraft and helicopters operating the airspace system. So it's really a function of balancing, in many respects, a lot of competing interests here. And I also think that we have just literally, Tommy, scratched the surface on the utility of drones, whether it's in motion picture or law enforcement or first responders or roof inspectors or agriculture or cell tower, flare stack inspection, railroad track inspection. Airlines, some of the airlines, I think outside the U.S. and I think even within the U.S., they're coming up with drones to inspect their aircraft in the hangar. So rather than put this extensive scaffolding up and the bucket truck and risking damage to the aircraft, and I've actually handled cases in which an aircraft gets damaged while it's in the hangar, by the people charged with responsibility for it. A drone is used to fly around the airplane fuselage while it's in the hangar or on the ground, and it takes photographs, it takes video of the entire surface of the aircraft, and it really allows very close inspection. So it's aircraft inspecting aircraft. Right. Also, inspection of runways. Every airport operator has to inspect the runways on a regular basis to look for foreign objects out there which can get ingested into the engines. They typically run trucks up and down the runway to look for debris of some sort. To have a drone zip up and down the runway, and not only is it faster and much more efficient, but you get a record of everything too. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The utility is enormous.
Utility is enormous. That is a fascinating. I mean, I know I'm about 90 miles from where Tommy's at right now, but the commercial utilization out here is by agriculture.
Oh,
the agricultural uses are massive. Rather than sending somebody to check on the crop necessarily that's on your 500 acres, they're checking grid patterns of crops using a drone. Yeah. I mean, the manpower that this saves is really impressive. Adam Kerpelman, a former guest of the show and founder of Get Juris, and a similar non-practicing lawyer like myself, has this question. And Adam's done some work in film and on the creative side in the past. He says he's curious if the rules are planning for swarms. And you and I had just talked about this. Adams is quite the techie. He says a whole bunch of those under the half-pound drones could pretty easily be programmed to operate together.
Right.
In that micro drone space. It's
happened. It's already happened. I want to say that it was at last year's Super Bowl during the halftime show. I think it was Intel had a section of the halftime show, and I'm subject to correction on this. There was a swarm of drones, and it was phenomenal. Mm-hmm. It was absolutely phenomenal. I think that if people did not understand that it was drones, they might have thought it was just computer-generated images that were being superimposed on the screen. Yes, the answer is that swarms of drones have been used, will be used. They typically, because of the number of drones involved, are going to be in much more controlled airspace than the drone that's going to deliver the package, even on the medical campus. And I think it's really an interesting question, because it's been the last couple of weeks, there have been all sorts of reports about swarms of drones in the Colorado-Nebraska airspace, and coming out at night. And there have been pictures all over the internet and the news channels. And the FAA and law enforcement and all sorts of people conducted all sorts of investigations, and they just haven't come up with any answers as to what they were. If you go back to this remote ID rule, there's a distinct possibility. I'm not going to go so far as the probability, but there's a distinct possibility that whatever that was could have been identified, and the owners could be identified if the remote ID capability was present. Now, if people choose to ignore the rules, you're always going to have people ignoring the rules. But swarms are going to be perfectly within the rules. And I should also add something else about the entertainment industry's use of drones. They were using drones before there was even a Part 107. The FAA did make allowances for the entertainment industry to utilize drones, because those are very controlled situations. And so that's something that's been very common for many years before drones have taken on the role they currently have.
Tommy, do you have something, or?
No, right. Other questions. I'm seeing the chat blowing up. Let's jump into that.
Yeah, and Adam, please feel free. I had a kind of a follow-up to that, Mark. The usage there, And for those listening, Mark is getting up at the moment and probably closing the door and yelling at the dog. The dog is welcome on screen, Mark. We have allowed dogs on screen in the past, so
that's the little dog. The big dog
naturally
is sitting here watching me.
Naturally, so. That's how it works. But my thought was, it's pretty simple. This thought's fairly simple, and I don't know if the regulations currently have any rules about this, but I'm thinking to myself, the remote ID on the drone, but I want to use this drone to do something I shouldn't be doing. So I'm taking my remote ID, just like you'd file off the serial number on a gun. Are the regulations setting any rules about that, defacing the remote ID?
Well, the answer is, will there be? The answer, absolutely, there will be. If you buy a drone and it's got remote ID capability and it's properly registered, and you disable it, or you give false information of some sort, there's no question that you're going to be violating federal aviation regulations, the remote ID rule. And I think just you make a good point in terms of, if you remove the serial number off anything that's serialized, that's required to be serialized, you're going to start to run into problems.
Yeah, it just seemed like this is one of those things that I don't want them telling me what to do. I'm disabling this. It just seemed like there'll have to be some repercussions for that. Yeah,
Look, I think if you sort of think about it, if I got a 7 or 8 year old son or daughter and I want to buy him a drone for Christmas, am I going to buy him a drone for Christmas? Because it's going to have to be registered. It's going to have remote identification capability. Am I going to give him that drone and basically expose him and me to the potential of the feds showing up at the door? I think that I don't want to say that the remote ID rule is it's a turning point, clearly.
Right.
Does it mark the end of drones as toys? In large measure, yes, it does, I think. We'll have to wait and see how that plays out, but when you have a 0.55 pound limit above which you fall within the rule, I'm not sure that many parents want to buy drones for their kids that are going to be federally regulated. So it's going to be interesting. But the fact is, at the end of the day, drones are airplanes. They occupy the navigable airspace. They can be flown, even though the rule says not above 400 feet, under Rule Part 107. You can take drones up to 1,000, 2,000 feet, well beyond your visual line of sight. Most of them, virtually none of them, have the hard programming that prevents it, and that's where you run into problems.
Well, and it reminds me a bit too of the regulations on motors you have on boats, right? Like where you have depending where you are, back home in Canada where I'm from, it's 10 horsepower. So like there's a whole market for 9.9s, right? And it's almost a thing of, where do you learn when you're up at the cottage to drive a boat on a 9.9 on a little dinghy farting around the lake? And maybe at some point before that regulation, I don't know, maybe you learned on a 80 horse motor that's probably a lot less safe. And it's almost a nice compromise. So you can still have them, but there is kind of it's like a toy motor. It's a learner responder. It's a 9.9. Beyond that, totally changes the game.
Well, I think the comments, I don't know what the current count is, but the last I heard, the comments on this remote ID rule were something like up to 6,000. Now, the FAA has to address all the comments, and as part
individually, they have to.
Well, they don't do it individually.
Okay.
The way they do it is they have to address them all in the preamble to the final rule. They have to basically say, we got this comment and this comment and this comment, and here's how we feel about it, and here's what we did or didn't do about it, or we agree or disagree. What they typically will do is they'll put the comments in buckets. So because a lot of the comments become nothing but form, organizations will basically provide their members with a template and just fill in some blanks, including your name, and then send it in. Well, what the FAA does is they'll generally say that we dealt with them in this category, and this category. And then they'll, to the extent that large organizations like the Academy of Model Aeronautics would offer comments on its own behalf, or DJI. I know DJI is going to offer comments. They may deal with those specifically, but ultimately, they'll factor in all the comments, and we may be at 6,000 now. So I think the suggestion has already been made that the comment period should be extended beyond March 2nd, because there's going to be so many. And then the FAA has to deal with them, and then they have to publish the final rule. But I still think they're under a lot of pressure. I think the final rule will probably come out, in my estimation, towards the end of the second, beginning of the third quarter of this year. But it's quite an undertaking.
That is a huge undertaking. I'm going to move to a little bit. Tommy and I are both kind of military history buffs, and Tommy, I had the opportunity to talk to Mark about this, and it gets a little more specific on the DJI itself ahead of time. But we were talking about this ahead of time. Mark, you said DJI is really up against a variety of issues. And I don't like to pick on anybody in particular, but there are a variety of issues with it being a Chinese-owned company. And what are they dealing with?
They first of all, the first drone I ever got or ever had was a DJI drone. And I think they clearly are I think they're the largest manufacturer of drones in the world. They got in pretty early with pretty sophisticated pieces of equipment. They obviously have come out with even more sophisticated ones and a full line of them. They're really dealing with two issues. One, they've got lots of drones out there which are not remote ID compliant. And there's going to come a time at which those drones, which are more than 0.55 pounds, are going to be in violation of the rule and won't be able to be operated. Then they've got to change the technology so that they're all compliant, that they may sell, because otherwise they're limited to the 0.55 pounds. So they've got a big market already. They've got a big market base already, none of which are compliant with the rule. The other problem they've got is a problem which predates the remote ID rule, and that is that the U.S. government is got concerns about the Chinese ownership. And DJI, as I recall, has said, well, it's not government ownership, it's private ownership. As I recall, the current status of the whole situation is that the Department of Defense will not allow any of its components to utilize DJI drones. I think at one time the Interior Department, which was a big user of DJI drones and continue to use them, I think just within the past week or 2 weeks, put their whole fleet down. They decided that they would put their fleet down. And it's all tied to the fact of the fact that it's Chinese owned, and the concerns associated with where's the information being streamed to? Is it really private? Is it really controlled? Or are you simply providing an eye in the sky to the Chinese government? So I think DJI is having to deal with those issues.
Tommy, follow up to that?
I was going to say that this keeps weirdly looping back into stuff I was doing when I was at Denton's, but once again, back in 2014, but same issue. There's a lot of questions from a regulatory perspective, even back in Canada, of partial government ownership or arm's length minority government ownership of Chinese companies that we're trying to move into sort of traditional Canadian sectors of the economy. And it was a major concern. This was less from a tech perspective. It was more tied to natural resources. But like I said, sort of very traditional parts of the Canadian economy. And I think that certainly from the stuff we were covering, it touches on so many different issues that it can very quickly complicate a lot of different things. And I'm sure in something like drone manufacturing and like where there's so many different components, as well as an obvious national defense component, I would think it really complicates it. And my mind,
I think I'm sure that most of the viewers have, if they're watching this, they have an interest in drones, and they probably have their own drones. And the technology is incredible. It's just pretty extraordinary. The cameras and so forth. You mentioned, Nick, agriculture. That's probably the number one use of drones. It's because you're talking about vast areas of open space. Mm-hmm. You're talking about a technology that is much more economic than flying helicopters or driving out to the fields, or ultimately in terms of crop dusting, spreading mm-hmm. chemicals and product. Using crop dusters as drones are going to be a lot better and easier and faster to use. The biggest problem that there is in the agricultural use of drones is sort of the presence of drones and crop dusters, both at low altitude, and the potential risk of collision over field.
Yeah.
They're not endangering buildings or people typically. Because we're talking thousands of acres. So mm-hmm. you've got this huge use, this capability. And you can hang all sorts of sensors from these drones. The sensors are incredibly sophisticated, mm-hmm. measuring water needs and crop rotation. And the very first drone client we ever had was a major agricultural producer. Yeah. And they wanted to use drones, and we got them a Section 333 exemption so they could fly drones. They wanted to use them for crop management, mm-hmm. The ability to monitor their crops, rotate them, and so forth, because the cost and the time was a fraction of what it was previously. And I think you're going to see a lot of, as the chemical industry improves the product, so you're not talking about thousands of gallons and thousands of pounds. You're going to see drones just be sort of move into that space entirely, I believe.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you discussed it's not really a threat even to the drone. It's really the pilot of the crop duster who's and damage to the crops themselves.
Yeah,
that's the real risk there, and so it is that. We're in the same navigable space that you talked about before.
Well, so in Japan, is it Japan? I think it's Japan. Yamaha came out a number of years ago, several years ago, with a drone, a helicopter. And it was about the size of, I would call a snowmobile. I mean, that's the best way to describe it, a motorcycle. And it was a drone. And it had tanks mounted on the side. And it was the principal means of crop dusting, and I think it was principally cotton. For some reason, cotton sticks in my mind. In Japan, was the use of this Yamaha drone, and they were moving it over to the United States. The big limitation there was the capacity of the tanks, because in a crop duster, you got big tanks. Mm-hmm. With a drone, you have weight limits associated mm-hmm. with how much product you can carry. But we're moving in that direction, and it's just a matter of time.
Yeah. Tommy, any last questions before we start to wrap up here? You got any burning questions for Mark here?
So something that I feel you often see in a new field like this is, at first, the hardware is advancing really, really quickly, and then you'll see consolidation. Now, with what we just talked about, you might have national consolidation, like each country has its own 2 or 3 drone companies. Typically, once that occurs, then it all goes into the software. And I think you've already seen that a bit with ag tech. There's really, really cool vision recognition technology, satellite imaging. Where do you see, we talked about where we think drones will be in 5 or 10 years. Where do you think the software they're using what will really push the frontier of that in the next 5 or 10 years?
Boy, that's a good
That's
question.
a very good question. I don't like it when my guests ask better questions than me. It's
and you
really.
gave me the layup.
I did. Go ahead, Mark. Just kidding.
I think there's a couple things I'd comment on. One, drones are by definition. I think we're going to have a lot of autonomous drones. Right now you can program the flight of the drone by GPS coordinates. I think what you're going to see is sort of the importation of AI, artificial intelligence, into a lot of this. I suppose there's a certain fear factor associated with it. At the same time, I think one of the biggest developments, though, talking hardware for a minute, is going to be batteries. There's I think real opportunity for advancement is battery usage, because right now, you're probably talking 6 minutes, 12 minutes, 25 minutes. There are some exceptions, but I think the technology there is really going to advance, because when you start to talk about delivery, drone delivery, we're talking about distances and so forth. If we're really going to be talking about distances, we're going to have to be talking about improved battery life, because the FAA is going to regulate the reserve battery life. In other words, you're going to have to take off with a certain reserve factor associated with your power supply or your fuel supply, just like airplanes have to have a reserve fuel to be able to go to an alternate. I think what you're going to see is a lot of these developments, whether it's software, whether it's hardware, batteries, are going to be driven by the regulatory universe that starts to evolve. And that is honestly what has slowed down the industry, is the regulatory universe, and it's not unique to the US government, but the enactment of regulations is a tedious process. And the fact is, I'm not sure that's going to change a whole lot. And that's what basically keeps the reins on the industry and has really prevented it from growing. And at the same time has created certain levels of frustration among people who have gone outside the United States to do their testing and so forth.
Yeah, you could see this being very, normally we on the show, we're normally interviewing startups, early stage startups. So you could see early stage startup in a heavily regulated industry like the one we've chosen to be in, right, Tommy? Yep. In the legal technology industry, heavily regulated. But you could see drone startups going through money really quick and running into the slow nature of regulation. But realistically, if we didn't have this regulation, we'd have those science fiction kind of dystopian future with everything flying around in the sky, and it'd be kind of chaos. So I think that is a great question, but the software advancements, interestingly enough, Tommy, Mark tied that right back into your day job of artificial intelligence, right? Yeah. So tied it
full circle here.
Full circle for you tonight. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. Mark, how can folks get in touch with you? How can they contact you?
Absolutely. My email is mdombroff, MDOMBROFF @foxrothschild.com. And if you want to look at our blog, the one I mentioned, it's www.plainly, PLANE-LY, plainlyspoken.foxrothschild.com. And there's complete access to the webinar that I talked about, as well as a whole bunch of other webinars, including the PowerPoint decks and access to the audio recordings.
And if they're interested, you've got an upcoming symposium. Is that a paid, or can they just register for that?
Actually, we have our 14th annual, the Aviation Symposium, on February 4th through 6th at the McLean, Virginia Ritz-Carlton.
This is an in-person symposium, not a
This is
not
an
web-based.
in-person. This is an in-person, and it's no charge. We're going to be talking about the drone world, and my former colleague and still consultant with us, Jim Williams, who is the father of Part 107, really, is going to be on one of the panels. And we don't charge for the symposium, so please join us.
Outstanding. Thank you for that. And so if you're in McLean, Virginia, that's February 4th through the 6th, join for the Aviation Symposium. And Tommy, how can people get in touch with you?
So my email address is Thomas, THOMAS, at Ross Intelligence. That's ROSSINTELLIGENCE.com. And then you can follow me on Twitter. Also, Nick and I like to think, have a lot of fun banter back and forth.
I like to think so.
So follow me on Twitter. It is at TJHammy. That's TJHAMMY.
Excellent. I will add this, Mark. You're very receptive on Twitter as well.
I am.
Yeah, you're very receptive on Twitter, and that's at Mark Dombroff. So at MarkDombrff. So get connected with Tommy and Mark on Twitter, and stay tuned. Next week we'll be back with episode 73, and that will be on January 30th. We'll be talking justice tech next week, so stay tuned for that. Thank you again, gentlemen, and don't disappear after we stop recording. Thanks, Adam, for joining us here in the webinar today, and we'll talk to you guys soon.